welcome to all of you. Thank you for participating. And I want to thank you for the support that you've given in different ways. I'm going to give a preview of the second volume that I'm now working on. And in this, it's going to be a slideshow. In this presentation, it's just going to be a taste of what will be in that book. It also is going to go only up to the 1880s, whereas the book as a whole is going to go up to our present era, so that we can focus something on certain themes here. So it's going to go fairly quickly, I hope, through these slides. And while there's not going to be a quiz at the end of the presentation, it might be useful to take a note or two in case you see something that piques your attention and you want to ask a question about it. Unfamiliar things or things that you're very familiar with and don't agree with what I've said or whatever. So I think we should start with the first slide now. Volume 1 of Who We Are was published in November. I hope that you have either read that or you will soon read it. It's going to be very useful, essential for getting what's going on in volume 2, but also it's the background of our country. It's the founding of the United States and the mission. And I've said here, it's how men of exceptional vision and passion for improvement fought for industrialization of the country. And this is, in the first volume, I've set out two systems: the British, primarily British imperial system, and our side. It's not just what's called the American system, because it actually starts in England with some remarkable people, friends of America. But the two sides in this story continue into the second volume. So next slide. This book will go from Abraham Lincoln to especially Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, essentially the same imperial opponents. And what we're focusing on is the increase in the power over nature and the power to uplift human beings in their status and their material standard of living. And that it's always, from these best leaders of our country, it's always geared towards universal progress. The people that I've selected as the leaders to be focused on in the first and second volumes are all universal progress advocates, and they've accomplished something for mankind. So next slide. The second volume overlaps the first. The first went up to the 1850s. We're going to go back here to take in Lincoln's actual background. He, as a legislator, he was the one primarily in Illinois who started the canal from Chicago to the Mississippi River, that made Chicago a great city, actually from nothing. And his program, his idea, his political idea, very, very specific, is unknown today. Teachers and historians and others in media don't discuss it. They talk about his presidency and slavery one way or the other, but his outlook, as we'll see a little bit of here, and I've gone into this in great depth in the first chapter of the second volume, is a terrific challenge to the present mode of operating by Western leaders. Next slide. In the 1840 presidential elections, Lincoln was still on the same track that he had been on since he started in politics in 1832. The president running for re-election was Van Buren. Now, you'll notice that Lincoln's name is in green and Van Buren's in red. This is a kind of representation of the two sides in the story. Green representing American system and red the imperial system, whether it's somebody from Britain or somebody working with them or pursuing the Southern imperial agenda and so forth. So in the election of 1840, Lincoln was very prominent in Illinois, and he made this speech. Many of you have heard this. It's not often discussed what he was talking about, even though it's a pretty famous speech. And he's talking about banking, political corruption of the establishment that has taken down the Bank of the United States. And he is swearing fidelity to this cause. He says, we might succeed, but if we fail, we can still say to our consciousness that what we wanted to accomplish, even if we're tortured and murdered, we never faltered in defending. So this is a kind of a wake-up call to people who whine about how the powerful men will never let us do anything and you can't beat them. Lincoln didn't agree with you if you have that point of view. I think he was right. Next slide. In the next presidential election, he worked for his beau ideal, as he called him, Henry Clay. You see the protector of American industry. In that election, Lincoln's speeches in Illinois and Indiana were all on the economic nationalist themes, high tariff, government sponsored transportation improvements, and the national bank. Next slide. You may suspect that our present economic system is a disaster and our economists are fools. Lincoln analyzed the error in our current economics. Now it's called globalism, then it was called the imperial system. He wrote notes to himself in his collected works. It's called Fragments of a Tariff Discussion. Attacking free trade, that's what kept the South backward and ruined the wages of our workers. He said that if you send your crops and your cotton over to Britain and exchange it for clothing and iron tools, and that's shipped back, all the work that's done to ship things on the ocean and even to take things over to the ports, to get those foreign things that we could have made at home, all of that is useless labor. And he makes a very funny analogy to the work, so-called, of picking up a burden on your shoulder and carrying it around the outside of your house in a circle, which is similar to the service economy that we have now, the post-industrial economy in the USA since the 70s. Next slide. Next, that's it, okay. This man was elected instead of Henry Clay, Lincoln's man. And Lincoln then ran for Congress, took his seat in 1847 when the Mexican War was on. What he was going to oppose this slave owner, radical anti-nationalist Polk. He was going to oppose him on economic themes, but now we're in a new era, and it was very impractical to be discussing the economic themes on a national campaign, because at that moment it was a dead horse. He had the same point of view. He kept that point of view, and it would be redeemed magnificently in his presidency. But now he had to deal with the crisis caused by the war against Mexico and the spread of slavery. Next slide. The war of the United States against Mexico, launched by President Polk, was the product of a political drive by a movement that was known at the time as Young America. It was a large and diffuse propaganda movement, mostly in the Democratic Party. It had lots of other reformers associated. But at the heart of this movement was something called the filibuster, or a man who is a filibuster. That could be what he does or what he's called. It doesn't mean a speech to tie up the Congress. That was used later for that meaning. In those days, it came from the word freebooter, a Dutch word meaning pirate. And it was people who had a private army, mercenaries or adventurers, to go invade primarily Latin America. That's what it was about. And they had the idea at the heart of this really insurrectionary movement that there would be a slave empire ringing the Caribbean all the way through Mexico into the top of South America. And that would overpower the United States and destroy it. Next slide. The people involved with these ambitions for a slave empire echoed and in many ways interacted with European imperial actions and philosophy. I have a list here of British military actions in this era. I don't expect you to, really be able to read all this, but you just get an idea looking at it, at the scope of these horrendous crimes against humanity all over the world. This is just the British. Then you've got the French, the Dutch, and others, the Spanish. But it's primarily the British, and they are the ones really moving these other imperialists. So this is going on at this time. You see in the picture on a bridge in China, the slaughter of the Chinese in the Second Opium War, which was during this period. That's where Britain forced China to accept the smuggling of opium into China so they could be ruined as a country. And then the Chinese fought back, and they, for the second time, slaughtered the Chinese. Next slide. So that's the morality of the filibusters, what they did in the Americas. In Congress, Lincoln offered his famous spot resolutions that proved the president had lied when he told Congress that Mexico had invaded the United States and we had to go and defend ourselves by moving troops into Mexico. He lost popularity in Illinois and elsewhere because of standing up against this mainly popular war. But it was immensely important, not only for his future, but for the reputation of the United States. That picture is a mural. It's in one of the state government palaces. It shows Lincoln and President Juarez, who was president at the time of Lincoln, and then Simon Bolivar on the right. Next slide. In Mexico, going as one of the generals there, American generals, he was a volunteer, but he rose to being a general. John Quitman. He was appointed by Winfield Scott to be military governor of Mexico City, and he ruled from the palace of the Aztecs, and he reveled in it. He asked the president to occupy and annex Mexico to the United States. He specified we have to drain their resources from their gold and silver mines, from their plantations, from their ports. We'll tax everything, which is precisely what the British were doing in India at the time. He was magnificently impressed by British military imperialism. He was over in England earlier. So just to be clear, he's an advocate of free trade, the imperial system, not the American system, not nationalist economics. And he opposes US government actions to benefit the population. Next slide. When the Mexican War stopped, this was the situation. Above that little red line you see on the right side is the free states in the north. Below that are the slave states, and Texas, you see, is huge. That's what Texas claimed. Mexico didn't agree with that. And there was a territory out to the Pacific, and really above that the problem was this going to be slave or free? This is the great crisis shaping up in the United States. Next slide. Lincoln himself was instrumental in electing the next president, who was a general in that war, one of the two commanders, Zachary Taylor. But he is not one of these Southern imperialists. He's actually a Southern slave owner, but he's a patriot. And so he ran for president on the ticket of the Whig Party, Lincoln's party, and Lincoln helped to get him nominated instead of Henry Clay, because this guy could get elected, for one thing. And he steadfastly opposed the spread of slavery. He didn't want to compromise. This guy, John Quitman, came back to the United States, and here he is dressed up as a politician on the right, and he became the big leader of the secession movement to break up the United States. And at the same time, he was the leader of the imperial adventures invading for further invasions. Next slide. He became governor of Mississippi, and he built a private army to invade Cuba. He financed that and gave armaments from the Mississippi arsenal. He was at the same time the head, really the big spark plug of the secession movement 10 years before the final one in 1860. President Taylor had him indicted along with 15 other people on charges of violating the neutrality laws. And at a certain point, he was arrested and he had to resign as governor. Next slide. I just want to call this to your attention. Quitman and his friends set up something called the Order of the Lone Star, which comes out of Texas. You see the flag of Texas. This logo was made into a flag at the lower left, the flag of Cuba, which was carried by these people in their invasions of Cuba. It was also both Cuba and Puerto Rico, which were conquered from Spain in the 1890s by the US, come from this disastrous, treasonous initiative. So this is a curious feature of live history right now. Doesn't this bear looking into? And of course, we have the Southern Latin American pivot on many American presidential assassinations into the 20th century. Next slide. So a group of the generals on the enemy side, on the pro-imperial side, met in 1851 to plan the next US presidency. The most important leaders of this were these three generals from the Mexican War: John Quitman, whom we just met; Jefferson Davis, you know him later on, he was a senator from Mississippi. Later on, he became the president of the Confederacy; and Caleb Cushing, little known today, but a very important man in US history. I have a whole chapter about him in the Treason book. And they met at Caleb Cushing's house. He's from Massachusetts. He's not even a Southerner, just hates what the United States is all about. They chose Franklin Pierce, who was another general, in their clique. And here you see a cartoon showing Winfield Scott on a, I guess he's on a rooster, and Pierce on a goose, making fun of Pierce for fainting and falling off his horse in the Mexican War. Next slide. An ineffectual man. As soon as Pierce became president, he campaigned on keeping the peace in the United States and not making agitation about slavery. As soon as he got in, together with Stephen Douglas, a politician from Illinois, they pushed through an act to open up the West to slavery, repealing all compromises, north-south, blowing up the country. The three leaders of this administration were two people in the cabinet and one who was not even an official, the same three guys that had picked Pierce to be president and run a behind-the-scenes charade to get him the nomination. These people, with Quitman with the backing of this government, mobilized thousands of private people and some soldiers, but it's a private army, armed forces. This was continually built up over the next 10 years until it was the fighting force at the beginning of the Confederacy. Next slide. Lincoln had been retired from active politics from the time that Zachary Taylor came into as president until now. This is about, what's that, 4 years, I'm not sure. Responding to this outrage where they repealed the compromises and said, we're going to get slavery all over the West and all over the world, all over the Americas and who knows where else. He came back into action. He was the real leader of the Republican Party that was formed at that time within Illinois. Other people who I'll get to led it in other parts. It was a coalition not based on the American system economics, but it had a desperate task to stop the spread of slavery. You had Democrats, Free Soilers, Know Nothings, and other parties who joined in this. Lincoln led it in Illinois. Now, personally, he studied history and economics. He read Henry Carey and the people that he had studied earlier. And he read universal history and Shakespeare and literature deeply. And he put together in his mind and began putting it into his speeches an entirely new conception of the founding of the United States and what was the mission of the country. Next slide. Man is endowed with creative reason. There are infinite resources available to man. Now, this is his speech on inventions and discoveries. He gave this speech several times. It was his favorite speech. All creation is a mine, and every man a miner. And I'm just going to paraphrase it here. The whole earth and man himself are the leads that a man uses to shape his destiny, to find out and shape his destiny. Beasts are not miners, but they just feed and lodge in this universe. Man is not the only animal who labors, but he's the only one who improves his workmanship. He affects this by discoveries and inventions. Next slide. In the same speech, note that, he attacks the Young America imperialists. We have all heard of Young America. He really mocks them. Some think him conceited and arrogant. He owns a large part of the world by right of possessing it, and all the rest by right of wanting it and intending to have it. And I want to paraphrase this as he would have, this last sentence here, because this is just an outline for his speech. He cites Plato, a quote from the Phaedrus, and he says that man has a pleasing hope, a fond desire, a longing after the immortality of the soul. Says, well, the Young America people also have a longing after something, but it's not the immortality of the soul, it's territory. Next. Lincoln's most important ally as an individual in the United States was the Philadelphia-based economic nationalist strategist, Henry C. Carey. His father, Matthew Carey, was one of the central figures in my volume 1. Carey, as you see, was an old guy. He was born in 1790s. There was in Philadelphia, and this again is carried over from the first volume. You really need to read that to get the sense of this, because it comes all the way from Franklin when he was there. There was a group of enterprises and individuals centered in Philadelphia from the time of the founding of the country, when Philadelphia was the capital of the country, through the 1820s and 30s, when you had the Bank of the United States headquartered there. And this was now a new setup with powerful people. There's a map of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the most important and biggest and best technologically railroad in America. The owners of that railroad overlapped ownership with many other enterprises in machine tools and locomotives, with institutions like the Franklin Institute, the University of Pennsylvania, the Philosophical Society. Most of this is based in Philadelphia. They are closely linked to West Point and the Naval Academy. And this is the center of these economic nationalists. And Henry Carey is their strategist. These two men here with the Pennsylvania Railroad are both disciples of Henry Carey. Next slide. This grouping around Carey and others who were followers of Carey organized particularly 2 states to get Lincoln nominated as president instead of Seward from New York. And the 2 states are Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, was elected, I guess you'd say, a month before Lincoln was. The election in Pennsylvania was or maybe it was the same time, I don't know, but it was before November. And they organized this important shift in politics. The idea was to base the Lincoln's nomination and election on working class politics. That means high tariffs. It means gearing the fight against slavery to the rights and dangers facing everyone, not just the slaves. All of these men were crucial. These three guys are all crucial, aside from Carey, are crucial in the physical protection of Lincoln before he's would be assassinated at the beginning. And they played substantial roles. I'm not going to go into that now. Next slide. In the coming years. The big change that took place, it was actually, I believe, 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration, but it was after he's elected, was that the tariff law of the United States, you see this graph, it shows you the Morrill tariff. That's the first jump. And it takes place right in 1861, just before Lincoln is inaugurated. And then there's more after that first tariff to raise it. Henry Carey personally organized throughout the country with his agents, with his friends, and also in Congress through these two representatives, John Sherman, brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, and Morrill, who the tariff law of 1861 was named after. This change in the tariff to raise it up more or less permanently became the United States policy. And then it was spread by the set of people we're talking about now to other countries, and it became the standard idea of nations in the world, aside from what the British system advocated. It was all the great nations adopted this system, and Carey was the center of organizing this change. And of course, this was Lincoln's whole platform and idea throughout his life. You don't see him talking about tariffs as president because he is governing as the leader of a coalition, and this is all still controversial. All right, next slide. The policies that were put through to set up a new national banking scheme, getting all the private banks, most of them involved as part of a national banking apparatus. The protective tariffs that ensure that cheap labor is not going to disrupt our manufacturing, and the government sponsorship of railroads. Those three measures in particular brought about the greatest leap of industrial progress, centering on inventions and new technologies, that has ever happened. And the big thing in the world was that America, and then other friends of America in other countries like Germany, Russia, Japan, and others, surpassed Britain. The USA itself surpassed Britain as the industrial leader in a very short time. This changed world history for good. You can't forget about this. If we're all wiped out in a nuclear war, then you may forget about it. But this is the permanent shift that has taken place with American leadership. There's a picture of Andrew Carnegie. He's one of this so-called Philadelphia interests. That's the owners of the Pennsylvania Railroad and allied groups. So he built this steelworks. It was the most modern thing. He would build it, tear it down after 2 years, and put even newer technology in there, paid good wages, so forth. Next slide. All of these measures to help farmers should be understood as being essential for US national security and the progress and power of the country, like free colleges, free science, railroads that were underwritten by the federal government, and the protection for the factories that turned out these wonderful heavy plows that could break the ground in the deep soil in the plains. When you talk about being generous to the population, you have to approach that from the standpoint of the needs of the nation that the leadership of the country is responsible for. So don't think of it as a giveaway. It is generosity. It is a giveaway, but it's what saves you and makes your country viable. Next slide. These are two among others that I know about them. You've all heard of them, I think. Robert Smalls, relative of Amelia Robinson, had a fantastic career of stealing a Confederate ship and delivering it, and doing some other amazing things to the, delivering it to the Union Navy. He personally was the main person responsible for setting up South Carolina's first public schools for white people or black people. This is in the Reconstruction period. Frederick Douglass, everybody knows him. What they don't talk about is that he was the political leader of the 2-year campaign that successfully rebuilt the city of Washington, D.C., taking it out of the swamp dirt pile that it was under slavery and making it, for a time, a model for a republic to show off to the world what republics are all about. I'm going to go into this in the second volume. Next slide. So Douglass went to looked at the accomplishments of Haussmann, the architect in Paris, studied them to implement them for a great architecture in Washington. There were 2 transcontinental railroads in the 1862, I believe, was the bill for the Pacific Railways. The first was the Central Pacific and Union Pacific. Everybody's heard of that. That's the lower one in blue on the map. The second one was done after the first was completed, and it was this Philadelphia group with Jay Cooke as the banker and the Pennsylvania Railroad people guiding the whole thing that built the second of Lincoln's 2 transcontinental roads. This went from Duluth, Minnesota out to Seattle, and it was explicitly designed to connect with the entire Pacific region, Asia and South America, to shift the geopolitics of the world in favor of peace and development. Next slide. In the 1870s, particularly under the leadership of Henry Carey and his circle, their agents acting directly in these countries, to the delight of the leadership of those countries, set up a different program for those countries, and they became great nations. This was the program: sovereignty, peace, cooperation, and the economics in the common interest. This was the United States of America as the world knew it at that time. And it was how everybody came to look at the United States. The USA can do anything, can accomplish anything. And we want to get part of that action. Next slide. Now I want to introduce another man who was a volunteer, became a general, to contrast him with John Quitman, the earlier fellow who did the filibusters, the attack on Cuba, and the governor of Mexico. William Jackson Palmer. He's one of this Philadelphia group. He is the personal assistant to the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And he was a Quaker. And he was very conflicted about war. He thought war was murder, and he never gave up that idea. He became a real leader of the technological advancement of the Pennsylvania Railroad, member of the Franklin Institute. Next slide. You'll see why I'm introducing him after we get into his career. So he was the leader of Philadelphia's branch of the Lincoln campaign for the youth movement called the Wide Awakes. They see these uniforms. And even though he was opposed to war, he volunteered. He was almost executed by the Confederacy as a spy. There was a real top level scheme that got him off. He manipulating some newspapers to fool them as to his status. He got away. And then he led his troops into Alabama and won the Medal of Honor. Next slide. He went out west to build railroads and built the famous, at that time, Denver and Rio Grande Railroad around Colorado. He founded Colorado Springs. He also founded the great steel industry and coal industry in Colorado. And he wanted everything to be beautiful, to fit into its natural surroundings. And he believed that people should be really civilized. So he outlawed saloons, not on a religious basis. Notice the locomotive there that is entitled the Montezuma. They used to have names on locomotives like ships do. That was the first engine for his railroad. Next slide. It was General Palmer, this man, who built Mexico's national railway. He wanted to take his own railway in Denver down to Mexico City and link the two countries so that the two republics could develop modern industry side by side. He successfully built the Mexican National Railway until it was taken away from him by people not so good. But he never was able to connect Colorado to Mexico because another railway run by some really deliberately bad people blocked him physically. They hired thugs like Bat Masterson, and they were going to do a shootout, but they actually beat him in court. They would have lost the shootout because he a Medal of Honor winner. The Santa Fe Railroad's trademark is there, the British Lion. Let's see why. Next slide. Here you see the two places in Colorado where the East-West Railroad, Santa Fe, crossed and blocked the North-South Railway. The president of the Santa Fe Railroad at that time was this grandson of Thomas Jefferson and son of a notorious millionaire opium dealer in Boston, paid by the Jardine Matheson Company $10 million a year in those days for running dope into China. That's his father, and he got into the same opium business. So this guy is the one who blocked America from linking up as the friend and sister of Mexico. He himself founded the United Fruit Company. So you get a good sense of this as a continuation of the earlier question of the Southern slave empire. And of course, this goes on all the way up through Teddy Roosevelt, up through Allen Dulles and these other guys, right? Into the modern times. Next slide. General Palmer needed a telegraph to run a railroad. And they set up their own company in New York to get around the Western Union monopoly. He sent his assistant on the railroad, who was part of this Philadelphia group, Edward Johnson, to New York to set up their company, the Automatic Telegraph Company. And they hired the young man, Thomas Edison, who was inventing, but he was not independent. He was working for Wall Street. They set him up in their own company, gave him money and the means to become completely independent. Johnson became Edison's business manager. Next slide. There was another man from this Philadelphia group, Professor George Barker, very important scientist in America. He was the research scientist for the Franklin Institute, really the same position as Alexander Dallas Bache was earlier, and that's in the first volume. He was a professor of physics and chemistry, vice president, long time for the American Philosophical Society, and so forth. He became Edison's science advisor and was deeply trusted by Edison the same way as Johnson was, because these are his sponsors. Next slide. Edward Johnson and Dr. Barker deliberately and carefully organized the circumstances where he would become famous. After the phonograph, in particular, they went to Washington and had a series of meetings with the government and scientists to make him famous. Next slide. Palmer, who started all this Edison operation, wrote to Johnson, "Edison's last developments beat Aladdin completely. I always declared he could invent anything he wanted to. Give him my compliments and tell him I wish he would discover for me some mode of building a railway to Mexico without money." Next slide. Edison and Dr. Barker went out with a scientist named Draper to the west on the new railroad, Transcontinental, to view a solar eclipse and test an amazing instrument of Edison's. And it was on this expedition that Professor Barker challenged Edison after briefing him on what's happening with lighting and electricity. Barker was perhaps the leading authority on that scientifically. And he said, why don't you invent a way of having a light that could be divided into small units that people could use in their houses and in other locations. And this set Edison on fire mentally, and he went quickly to devising an entire system. Had a press conference and said this system of light and electric power has been invented, and it's going to take over the world. It's going to change the world. Next slide. Now, you have to understand the financial situation at the time. If you don't get what's on this slide, you haven't understood anything about Edison or really about American history. Unfortunately, you have to go into Edison's papers and other direct sources and some biographies to get the story, because this is deeply, deeply embarrassing to the Anglo-American establishment. J.P. Morgan, the banker in New York and London, and John D. Rockefeller, who were both of them part of the British imperial system within the United States, at this time were in a war against this Philadelphia group, against the Pennsylvania Railroad and against Jay Cooke, and against, obviously against the program and economic ideas of Carey. And they were personally involved in the destruction of a lot of the railroad power, and in setting up the economic crisis of 1873. Our people in Philadelphia at this point were deeply short of funds. Edison had to go to Morgan to get the money to do a demonstration on scale of his light and power system. So under that setup, Edward Johnson went to London. He did the same thing that Edison did in New York. He did it in the city of London. This is for the financiers. Johnson built the world's first demonstration plant of an electric power station for the public. Edison built the second one called the Pearl Street Station in New York. It was built for J.P. Morgan's house and surrounding residences. At that point, J.P. Morgan told Edison that we are not going to have any more power stations built until we see how the market responds to electricity. Well, obviously there was no market for electricity. Nobody had any plugs. There wasn't any such thing. So it was stopped, dead, completely dead. Next slide. Edison and these Philadelphia sponsors, as well as they could, went to war to stop this crippling of electricity. And the result was the breakthrough that I'll describe here. They set up something called the construction department of the company, which was free of Morgan's control. And Edward Johnson brought in two men who were crucial. Samuel Insull became the secretary to Edison, and Frank Sprague was brought in to supervise plant construction. Both men really important later in electricity. Edison staged a stockholders' revolt to get control of his organization, and he put Edward Johnson in charge of the company once he had taken it back from Morgan's control. Now, that didn't last forever. That only lasted for a few years, but it was enough to get things started. Now, I want to ask Hal Vaughn. Are you there, Hal?
Yeah.
Could you say a couple of things about Edison's personal role? Let's get the next slide on here, and I'll have this on when he's giving you this. Go ahead, next slide, there it is. So go ahead, tell us a little bit about Edison's personal role in this.
Okay, well, Edison was committed to having these central stations built. What you've been talking about, putting lights out to people's houses. In the process, and to develop the technology, they also had isolated stations, which you could put in a factory. You'd put a steam engine in a factory to create electricity to light the factory and use the electricity otherwise. And actually, part of his company was deployed around the country to get these things installed. And they were very popular. He had lots of competition in setting these up in the US and in England and in France. But Edison was always committed to actually getting light into people's houses through central stations. And how he did it was that he had all these representatives all over the country and the world selling, building, and creating these isolated stations, which took off like a shot. Like 1881, 82, 83, it went up exponentially. About half the business was in Europe and half in the US. And the scale of the operations allowed him to reduce the price, for example, of actually building the light bulbs, so that it was commercially viable. But Edison insisted that his mission was to illuminate the country. And so since he had this network set up all over the place to build these isolated stations, he had representatives all over the country. And what they did is deliberately surveyed town after town to find areas where the houses were concentrated enough that a central station could in fact light enough homes to make it actually practical. So it was Edison, the way I read it in this book by Edison, about Edison, was that he was desperately.
The book you read is written by the longtime director of the Edison paper, so he really knows what he's talking about. Go ahead.
Book. Yeah. Edison, because all the people, well, a lot of the people working for him said, "This is great. We're making money. It's actually technologically productive. We can, if we have the economy of scale to make the light bulbs." So these isolated stations, which they even put on sailing ships or on steamships, which is a perfect place to put to electrify, because they already have an engine. So you just hook the generator to the engine.
Let's get back to this. Go back to the towns, right? So he said, let me take it from here, okay? That's you got the background. So Edison himself went into the first towns. These are in Pennsylvania, and worked in each town with local people who set up local companies. Edison took 20% of that, and Edison's people built the power station. This happened all over the place. It was actually in hundreds of places, many places. I don't know if it was hundreds, but it was more than 100 to begin with. The first one was in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. And this was the beginning of electricity for the people of the world. They had used electricity in certain applications like telegraphs, but that wasn't electricity that people could use. It was just on the wires of a company. This is a shift, a universal shift in human history that took place. Really, you could say, you could date it from July 4th, 1883, when the first plant went up in Sunbury. Now, you also know that he made partners, particularly Rathenau of Germany, and electricity was introduced both by Edison and Rathenau all over the world. Next slide. There is a little plaque in that town of Sunbury. Thomas Edison, greatest inventor in history, first electrification project, and the birth and death dates of Edison. From there, as you all know, or should know, you had these other, Morgan finally took over Edison's company. Many other things happened to set up Wall Street in control of the electrical industry. And that was not really, what they did is they stopped the spread of electricity to most people. Farmers never got electricity, most of them. Africa still has 500 million people without electricity. It took Franklin Roosevelt to bust this whole situation loose. That's another story. That's as far as I'm going to go with this presentation. So I would entertain questions now. And maybe you want to, how do we do this? Maybe, can you send, is it good to address? There's a lot of people that's on, so maybe address something. Mark, what do you think?
People can unmute themselves and just speak up.
All right,
Anton, may I ask a question? This is Randy Puckett.
go ahead.
Okay, I'm not going to disagree with you on Edison. You obviously don't know, you know the man, but I'm going to say a name, and I just want you to say what comes to
Are
mind.
you going to say Tesla?
Yes, sir.
How did I read your mind? You know how I read your mind?
You're that good.
Because if you say nuclear power, I know what you're going to say. If you're anti-nuclear, you're going to say, what are you going to do with the waste? And most people will not stay to hear the answer because it's not really a question.
I will listen.
I get your question, okay? Because this question is something that is it's a programmed response that's built into the culture now. And we are taught for various reasons that industrial progress is no longer, or should never have been, the right of human beings. And so the premise in this, making Edison the bad guy and Tesla the good guy, and then a whole bunch of other lies that are built on this, like that Morgan actually backed Edison to do what he did instead of trying to block him. The premise there is that you don't care, or you're not supposed to care, about whether human beings have a good living standard. Now, there's other parts of this, right? Because we have other considerations. One of them is pollution that enters into our mind. You can't have industry without pollution, according to this way of thinking. Well, that's wrong. You can have industry without pollution. You can solve those problems, but you can't solve them without industrial advancement. The other part of it is lifestyle. Since the murder of Kennedy, we've shifted our philosophy, we've shifted our economic strategy, we've shifted our religious ideas, all kinds of things. And we have lifestyles now, which are more important to many people, or especially to the media, than the rights of man. The two things are confused. Is it really a right of the average person, or even the poorest people, to have electricity, to have indoor plumbing, to have modern medicine, to have a scientific education? Are those the rights of man, according to the Four Freedoms and Roosevelt and Kennedy and so forth? Those are the rights of man. And as far as I've established throughout this history, those are the rights that were really in the minds of our founding fathers. So I'm not going to get into Tesla. I know, I'll tell you this, that just a very simple answer. There was a fight at a certain point between Westinghouse and Tesla against Edison over the question of alternating current versus direct current. The direct current was the first application. Alternating current was an advancement important for one specific purpose, which was to get long distance transmission beyond a mile to a few miles, instead of having successive electric plants. An important advance. But the setting up of the electrical industry in the world had nothing to do with this. This was a fight that came in, and I believe the fight was orchestrated by, clearly by the interests who were opposed to this American nationalist political industrial grouping. This is something that you can't understand at all until you have some concept of our side in history. If you are simply focused on bad guys and good guys, and the bad guys are all powerful beings in wherever they are, Wall Street, London, Freemasons, whatever else it is, if it's just the bad guys, and you have no conception of the rights of man to be advanced in their minds, in their spirits, in their music, in their concern for other human beings, and especially in their right to have a decent home for their family and a decent existence. That's human rights. And that's what our side is uniquely responsible for. So if you're going to judge Edison versus Tesla, you have to think what was done to create an electrical industry in the world, in Russia, in Germany, in Japan, in South America, in the USA. How did this get started? Oh, you mean Wall Street didn't start it? Wow, that's a revelation. Let's start with that. Wall Street did not create the electrical industry. They tried to stop it. That's my answer. So let's go on to the next question.
Yeah, I just have one thing. It's on this filibuster
Yes.
crowd. You know, have you heard of this guy, Frederick Townsend Ward?
Say it again.
Frederick Townsend Ward.
No, tell me.
Yes, I think he was definitely part of it. He was in China commanding this supposed army that was fighting against the Taipings. I think he was part of this whole mercenary operation. Now, the British played both sides of this thing.
Right.
To tear China apart. They played the Taiping part, and they played the helping the imperial government part. Because when Ward was killed, you know who took over that command was Charles Chinese Gordon. So it's a perfect example of the British working with this crowd. If he is in fact part of it, I'll have to look it up.
That's a crucial story. In the first chapter of volume 2, which I've already written, I have the story of Caleb Cushing, of this representing the Boston opium guys, going to China as a U.S. Envoy to get a treaty from China just after the British crushed China in the first Opium War. So he goes there to get a treaty like the British got that allowed Americans to go in and loot China. His friends, the opium guys, he comes back from China to Mexico and scouts out for the Polk, administration just before Polk, how we're going to make a war in Mexico, which he considered to be an inferior race and they need to be governed by slave owners. Then he comes back to America and he's one of the principal leaders of the filibuster crowd. So what you're talking about in China is the anti-American Americans who go over there in tandem with the British in all kinds of games. They're often on two different sides, maybe even the same person. And Lincoln, when he was president, sent, as many of you know, a wonderful ambassador to China, Anson Burlingame, to nullify this earlier treaty, to say China has to have sovereignty, not foreign devils. Lincoln also sent a wonderful ambassador to Mexico, Thomas Corwin, who had been, like Lincoln, opposed to the Mexican War and got in a lot of political trouble for it. So these are the two sides in operation. Keep in mind that when I use the expression American system, meaning primarily economic measures to build up the country, with the federal government playing a central role in guiding this buildup, not owning the industry, but guiding the development of the country. a central component of this system is peace in the world, cooperation between nations. You don't have the American system without a passionate commitment to world peace and hostility to the games that are played by the imperial system to have permanent war going on. Next question. Everybody's muted unless you unmute yourself.
I have a question about Lincoln's Bank. I was
Who's
wondering if
that? Who's
I,
this?
I have a this is Sean.
Okay.
I have a question about Lincoln's Bank. I was wondering if that was the same bank as Harrison's Third National Bank that he tried to create prior to his mysterious death in 1840.
No, it wasn't. We had the Bank of the United States, and then the Second Bank of the United States was closed down by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, working with the Southern anti-nationalists. And then that was very unpopular, and we elected Harrison to get a Third National Bank of the United States, but that was very short-lived. He died a month later, and his vice president was a snake, Tyler. So at that point, politically, the Bank of the United States was a dead idea. And Lincoln did not simply make a bunch of slogans in politics. He took responsibility for the country, just like Franklin Roosevelt did, just like other people have done. And so like a parent takes responsibility for the children. You have to be very sophisticated to do that. So Lincoln came into office as president, and the banking arrangements that were set up, national banking was not a central bank, but it was a law, a set of arrangements that tied private banks into the goal of developing the country. They had to invest in US securities, and they went under anti-usury and other rules. This was a national banking system that lasted a great deal of time. And it's important to note that Lincoln personally intervened with the Congress to push this banking thing through early in his presidency. He did not do that with the tariff or with the railroad, although those were his programs. He let the Congress and his allies do these things otherwise, but the banking was his own personal, he was passionate about that all his life. So, but it wasn't the Bank of the United States. We need some kind of central bank now for developing infrastructure for sure. You can't have, it's not going to work otherwise. Go ahead. Next question.
Hi, Anton. This is Carlos. Thank you very much for a wonderful
Carlos.
speech. Learning so much over here. So I'm going to resign as a banker after listening the speech, and I'm going to apply to become a national banker. No, but one question: is there any U.S. national bank right now? I know it's Exim Bank, which is obviously for trade and to support all international trade of the United States, but there is not any national U.S. bank, no, at the moment, or yes?
I don't know if the Exim Bank still exists, but the answer.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah, sure. So when Franklin Roosevelt was president, what's the name of the bank? It was an agency of the federal government. It wasn't called the Bank of the Central Bank. It wasn't the Federal Reserve, but it was used to fund the development of industry and
the RFC, Tony.
The RFC, right?
Right.
And the Exim Bank has been used also later on. FDR even got his own man in charge of the Federal Reserve. People make a fetish out of the Federal Reserve to say this is the heart of all evil, just like saying some secret group is the heart of all evil, without considering our Constitution, which sets up the federal government and the nation as instrumentalities for progress. The Federal Reserve was not created in 1913 for the progress of the country. It was part of a set of banks in a national banking system, with the Bank of England predominant. But there have been other instruments used by US presidents, especially Franklin Roosevelt, to guide the progress of the country. So there's the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were set up for that purpose, to do that internationally, in the original framing of that by Roosevelt and Harry Dexter White and the other people who set that up, with the cooperation of the Russians and other people, the best people in other countries. The answer to this is that it is the political philosophy and the together with the crisis of the economy, Carlos, that is going to determine whether we get the kind of banking arrangements that we need. Now, we clearly have, except for the most insane people, a failure of the overall conception of economy. We have a breakdown that was foreseen quite a while ago, but here it is with the supply chain, with other things that are appearing in this economic breakdown. Obviously, we have a buildup of unsupportable financial speculation. But the real issue for everybody is, how do you get people to act in favor of using finance for the benefit of the economy and for national interest? And that's clearly why you need to look back at how we did these things in the past. It's possible to use banking for the benefit of progress and the benefit of the living standards of the public. That was the founding idea of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. That's in the first volume, that banking can serve those purposes. And people who point to evil bankers as an excuse to say there shouldn't be any central banking or any kind of national banking or any kind of guiding of the economy from a program for the people's benefit. If you say that, it's just a lie. It's a famous historical lie that attacks banks per se as the problem, or a central bank as the problem. The issue is, what is the purpose of the nation and the government? We have a particular mission and a constitution based on the general welfare, and we've accomplished these things. We did that to a certain extent with the first Bank of the United States. We did it in the first wave of industrialization in the 1820s and 30s with the second Bank of the United States. And we can use new instrumentalities, but we can also use the present, certain aspects of the present system under different programmatic guidance. And I think we do need an infrastructure bank now. That's in Congress to decide. But we look at China, and we look at particularly in China, where the biggest banks now, biggest really practical banks in the world are. And they are used, like Bismarck used his banks, for the progress of the country and for the progress of other countries. If you don't think that's true, maybe you don't think so because you don't see that the US did that in the past. That's the problem. You don't know American history. American history was based on using private and public instrumentalities to develop us and mankind. That's our system. So the next question. People could unmute themselves if they want to ask a question.
So this is Clark. I won't take the video off so you won't see me in my sweats. But how do we get the banks back? I mean, the Federal Reserve System is so systemically corrupt at this point. The member banks have been self-dealing for years. JP Morgan is a serial felon. Jamie Dimon has racked up 5 major felonies during his tenure there. Is the solution to destroy the member banks? Will a national bank come out of a collapse where these things get resolved in the public interest? The derivatives book now, I understand, is twice what it was in 2008. So it's only a matter of time.
Let's go back. I think that the question is not a simple answer, right? Because you're talking about how do you shift public thinking and public philosophy,
Right.
and public and political power. How do you bring about that shift? So let's consider, first of all, what we just went through for 4 years when Trump was president, and the country got Trump mania, right? People devoted their lives to bringing Trump down. In the initial phases of his presidency, the establishment was hysterical to stop him. And then as time went on, when he was doing really bad things, like with Iran, with the crazier and crazier about China, the different things, catering to the immigration stuff, it's more complicated. But the Democrats never really attacked the issues. They never said what was wrong. They just attacked him. Now we have Joe Biden as president. He just had a virtual meeting with the president of China to back away from what would go towards nuclear war with Russia and China. Good idea not to have a nuclear war. Where are the Democrats? Where are the Republicans? Oh, maybe there's your problem. You can't look to the present discourse, the present discussion to solve the problem. I would say the first step is to go back 2 days from now is the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. Go back there and look at the changes brought about in the United States since then. What changed? Well, we changed our system of government and our system of economics, our economic strategy, and the philosophy of the country away from this idea of progress. But this is a very, very broad and deep change that occurred. At the time of his murder, there was in process a beautiful alliance that was building up between the presidency, him and his brother and others, the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King and others, and the best of the labor unions, along with many forces in US industry, like represented by Kaiser and other people like that, as against these insane leaders of NATO, people who were looking at the national interest. If you go to Martin Luther King's memorial in Washington, you will see that he speaks of the interest of all the people. He would have made a great president from that standpoint. And remember that he and both Kennedy brothers were all murdered. I would call it a triple murder. We had the chance at that point if that were to continue, to have a government that served the public interest, bridging the racial divide and serving people regardless of many differences of opinion and other differences. Certainly lifestyles are irrelevant. And if you're going to get out of our current mess, you have to have a proposed philosophy for action that is in the obvious interest of a great majority of the people who work for a living and who want to be safe in terms of having an income, surviving collapse, and want to like their government again. They want to be human again. Our culture is terrible. This is a failed state right now. We have a failed society in so many ways. Go back and look at what we did as great accomplishments in our civilization and also in our country, both. Go back earlier than the US. Look at the great accomplishments of our culture. The West culture and the cultures that we're now joining with in China and other countries that were ancient and that are now modern, more modern than we are. But you have to have a philosophy for action that the public, in supporting it, would be a solid majority in support of a government. We haven't had that for a long time, have we? That's what you need. That isn't going to bring everybody together, but it's the only way to win. And I think that there are people running out of other options now, right? So just look at the way the media treats Biden, the way they treated Trump. Is that surprising to people?
Of course not.
Take a look at that. Okay. Next.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, good. So that's really the central question. I think that's the best question, really. That's it, right? What are you going to do? How are you going to get this? And that's a deep searching question. But that question that you asked is what everybody needs to be asking now. How do we get from here to having a majority government in the interest of the whole population?
As you were
Minus
talking,
maybe Jamie Dimon. Of course, I think he could get a good job, a different job, right? But so it's not in his present interest to do what we need to do. But otherwise, it's in everybody's interest.
as you were talking, I was thinking of what Lincoln said in the first inaugural, which is that we must disenthrall ourselves and then we can save our country. Something's got to break the spell that people are under. And a financial collapse that ended up resolving the member banks of the Federal Reserve and the public interest is one thing, if there's somebody to guide that storm. I don't see it in the Biden administration, but it could come from that's one way it could happen. But I breaking the spell, kind of unfreezing the national consciousness is.
Let's go back to what Lincoln said in that speech in 1839. He said, let us pledge that we're going to do what we have to do now and put before the people what needs to be done. And regardless of whether we win or lose, let us have a strategy for winning in motion.
Yeah.
Now, what did he do in the period between the Mexican War and his presidency? He studied deeply. There's that speech, right? I feel this whenever I feel the soul within me elevate and expand when I contemplate the cause of my country, deserted by all the world beside, and I standing up boldly and alone and hurling defiance at her victorious oppressors. That does not mean impotent sloganeering against bankers or against anybody. It means having a concept of how we are going to govern and what we're going to do. What's our policy? How we're going to put together this kind of a successful government. What does it need to do? What do the other countries need? Because we're going to have a cooperation between the big countries in the world and with the poor people of the world as well in mind. So it's important for people who have that commitment that they are committed to getting ready for this kind of a government that we need, that they deeply study to prepare themselves. What do they have to study? They have to study how this was done in the past. That's why I have changed my focus in history. That's what I'm devoted to, trying to put together the story of what our civilization, particularly the US at the moment in my work, accomplished, and how this was done in modern times, basically leading up to the present situation. Go back to what we were, which is who we are if we're anybody. You have to know these things. I would like to get your help, not only in different ways to put this book together, the second volume together, but read the first volume and help to get this story out, but also equip yourself with an overview and with your own work to see what our world, our successful world and our successful country has been all about. How did that happen? What was it? You're not told that. Don't simply flail away at bad people and evil institutions and then say, well, we can't do anything about it because the public is corrupt and the bankers are corrupt and so forth. So we have a great chance. Look at those ships sitting out there in that harbor. Why aren't they coming in? Who decided that the port wouldn't be modernized, that the trucking wouldn't be modernized, that we should have no workers? Who decided we shouldn't prepare for this pandemic? Who decided we shouldn't stop the pandemics that are going to spread in Africa if they don't get electricity? Who decided they shouldn't have electricity? Who decided these insane things? It's the port, right? So these are the ships piled up there carrying things from China or from some other countries. We need trade. Lincoln said we need trade, especially we need to import things that we can't make here. We can't grow coffee in the United States. Got to import it. And we should be able to trade really good things with other countries. But every country should have its own sovereignty and its own full set of capabilities. Every country should be modern and scientific and powerful. It's a much safer world that way. If you have these ideas and you look back and understand that these ideas are the United States ideas. Our present system is not the system of the United States. It's a simple black and white thing. You can't, that's not ambiguous. If you understand the two sides within the United States history, one side dedicated to advancement of the country and the world, and the other side dedicated to an empire. That's it. That's our background. So to get forward into where we have to go, you have to know who we are from that standpoint.
Thanks. Thank you. I agree.
Mr. Zwirtz, is that it?
Tony, what's your view of House Resolution 3339, the National Infrastructure Bank Act of 2021?
It ought to be passed. And it's got a lot of support around the country. What's the number of the bill? Just National Infrastructure Bank. You just look it up. It'll go through. Good. Who's here? Okay, here it is. Yeah, so Mr. Is it Swiertz? It says, so you think the Trump presidency wasn't on the side of the American system? I didn't really get your reply. Trump came out against the dominant free trade system in certain ways. He even made a speech about Henry Clay at one point in Kentucky. And in some other ways, he opposed globalism. What he did not do is calmly and as a credible person, educate the population about what this is about. What is this? In other words, if you look back, I don't want to denigrate Trump, because I certainly would take his side against the establishment that did a coup against him from the very beginning. But if you go back to Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt or John Kennedy, or actually many other people who were leaders, presidents and not presidents, there were many people in our history who took responsibility for educating the population, and not with slogans, not in a partisan way. Yes, he was under attack from the very beginning. But what is his character? What was he doing as president? He didn't act in such a way as to go before the public in a calm and rational manner and tell them what just happened. We've just gone through a half century of an insane, failed policy and philosophy. We made a deep mistake as a country and as a society. We have to recognize that mistake. I'm not talking about apologizing for anything. You have to recognize that that mistake is still being made. You have to explain what it's about. And that means that you'd have to understand what the economic measures have been in the past. You'd have to understand or get people who do understand it to brief you and say it about what kind of manufacturing philosophy we had in the past, what kind of science philosophy we had in the past, what kind of cooperative policy we had with Russia and China and Japan and Germany, for example, 4 countries that became our enemies. They were our allies. And I'm not just talking in World War II or as Russia and China were, but Japan was our enemy and Germany was our enemy. Earlier, they were our allies. They were our allies as part of our system. Our system. Trump did not even reference these things. Vladimir Putin did, much more than Trump did. He didn't go into American history. I also believe that Putin and anybody like him makes a mistake if they shy away from telling Americans about their own history. They should. So should Canadians or anybody else who knows it. Right? The United States has a responsibility to return to good behavior, which was a blessing to the world. But you have to explain to the American people what they're doing wrong, what they've done wrong for a generation, a couple of generations. what we had for human rights before, quote, lifestyles, unquote. What is man? All of the best leaders were philosophical kings in Plato's sense. The best ones were all like that. They weren't philosophers, but they certainly were much deeper philosophically than anything recently. And you can't do it simply by having a screaming match and hoping to have a plurality of people on your side so you win an election. That's insane. That's not going to work. That's what Trump was doing. And of course, his opponents did as well. Now we have another president. What's the next step? Are we going to have the same thing here? Republicans, many of them want the same kind of screaming. Democrats aren't even focused on the issues largely. But we have a shot at something different now because it's not working. It's clearly not working. It's getting worse. So there's an inevitable crisis, just like there was in the 1850s. Lincoln prepared himself for that. We should prepare ourselves for that too. But you can't understand what was wrong with Trump or with the partisan divide without going back to our earlier history. In the 1850s, the party that Lincoln was a passionate member of, the Whigs, ended. It was abandoned. It was baloney. It was corrupt. The Democrats were the enemy, but most of the Whigs were the enemy too. So some of the best ones from them and some of the best Democrats came into the new operation, which was the Republican Party. Of course, the Republican Party later on became not so good, right? So it's not the party. It's having some proposed philosophy of action that has to be a central focus of educating the public and saying what you've done now and recently is not working. You will die as a result of continuing in that mode. We have to make a shift. Here's the way we have to proceed. Here's the way it worked in the past. Here's who we are. You have to get this identity of the Americans with this beautiful past. And people will immediately scream about bad things we did. I'm bringing out all those bad things in this book. The war against Mexico, the treatment of the Indians, I'm going to go into that, was largely a result. The Indians is not quite as simple, but it was, in many respects, it was also a result of this Southern imperial idea that drove a lot of it. The other thing was shutting down the West. America did some very bad things, and it's doing very bad things right now in the world. Who are we? As a country, we are the magnificent mission and constitution. That's who we are, if we're anybody. If we're not those things, I guess you can blow your brains out, but I wouldn't recommend it. Why don't we just be that good thing who the world learned to love in the past? Why shouldn't we have people like us and make ourselves powerful again? That's who we were. That's who we are, really. Trump didn't bring that out. I mean, he said, make America great again, but what did that mean? Beyond the red hat.
Tony, Randy Puckett asks, do you see trade with China as beneficial to the United States? And if so, would this idea not be counter to Lincoln's ideology that goods should be produced in the United States when possible?
In the later 19th century, there was an outgrowth of the American system and was known then as reciprocity. It was first proposed to, in conjunction with South American, Latin American countries, and even Canada, although Canada was somewhat problematic. But the idea was that we would have cooperation in working out a trade arrangement between friendly nations that would exclude cheap labor stuff from the outside of that zone. And we would have mutually beneficial regulations and tariffs to boost the interest of both countries. So in our present world, you have to start with national sovereignty. That is, each nation, shouldn't we have self-government? Yes. Our government is primarily responsible for the interests of the people of the United States, not a foreign country. And we shouldn't meddle in those foreign countries. Their governments should protect their own interests. In order to succeed technologically, and in order to succeed in terms of any kind of success in what we're trying to do politically, we have to have cooperation between the leading countries in the world. And we have a common interest with every nation in the world. There's no nation in the world that's our enemy. To say that we're competing with China is only true in a certain sense. China was designated by people back in the 70s, I guess, as a cheap labor place to send our businesses to, so they could take advantage of cheap labor, and like Mexico and other countries, and Burma and African countries. The Chinese somewhat judoed that, using the concentrated investment from outside with their own regulations and their own intentions to build up modern capabilities and their own power. And they became a world power industrially, and more took over the role that the United States in the past had played, which is to develop the world with partners all over the place, like we used to have. What's our objective in the world? Do we care about what happens in another country? You're not, the person who asked the question, I guess Randy, you're not primarily an American. First of all, you're a human being, right? Second of all, you have philosophy, whatever it is. You might have a religious belief. You have maybe have a family.
Sure.
All of those things are part of your humanity. Why do we have a nation? To accomplish great things. There are nations that people are born in that don't have too much meaning for them, but often a nation has a past that is linked somehow to great accomplishments in culture and other things. And so we are Americans, and we love our country for the good that it's done. Otherwise, why bother? Who cares? I don't care about it just because I was born here. What sense does that really make, right? People leave countries to go somewhere else for good reasons. My father came here from Latvia in 1909 when he was 11 years old. But so your primary goal is the success of the future. What are we going to do for a future? Obviously, the first issue is, should we have a war with China and Russia? If you're saying that that's not a reasonable possibility, you're mistaken. You're not. Most people who say that or believe it are not willing to discuss the matter publicly. They just try to bully their way. They just say, don't think about that. Reasonable people, including many people in Washington, are now shying away from and hope to guide the country away from that kind of outcome. We need to cooperate with China and Russia. Now, a significant part of my second volume book and stuff that I've already written goes into how we were taken away by force, by murder, away from cooperation with Russia and communist countries. And not because they were communist. Kennedy was anti-communist. It's irrelevant. Lincoln didn't care for the czarist system, and Tsar became a very good ally of ours. The King of France was an ally of ours in the revolution. That's not the issue. The issue is, what do we do? What do we want? What do the Chinese want? What do the Russians want? The Russians and Chinese are both for national sovereignty. Chinese are developing the world. What are we doing in the world? We're making wars that are insane, not in our interest. We lose all the time. So we have to have this cooperation. We should have a buildup of American manufacturing. Yes, we should make laws, tariffs, and any other rules we need to build up US manufacturing, to restore 21st century US manufacturing. That's nuclear power, that's fusion power, that's hydrogen, that's a lot of things in the future. It's especially the space program. It's also dams and lots of other things. But you can't simply say, let's put a tariff on and we'll have manufacturing. What's the actual policy? What do you want to accomplish? Do you want to have really modern civilization and fulfill the right of people all over the world and in our country to have a good living standard? There's many different things that you have to do to bring that about, but that's the goal. Tariffs are one instrument for bringing that about, but conflict between the great powers right now is the enemy's game. And the enemy is a small clique of really crazy people who have a lot of power. And these are neoliberals, neoconservatives, and you know, a significant component of that's in Britain, but there's a lot of very good people in Britain who hate this baloney. And I guess they're baffled by, you know, Prince Charles and the other princes and this and that, because who are not part of the modern society. They're just contrary to the accomplishments of mankind in modern times. Not to speak of, why do you have kings, you know? So is that enough? I don't know. What time is it now? It's 3 o'clock. Maybe we should, unless somebody's really, Mark, are there any other good questions in the hopper?
Oh, there are.
I have a,
Michelle, wonderful. Go ahead.
Tony, I just want to, we're old friends, but I just wanted to greet you from Denmark and say that I enjoyed your speech a lot. I work with the Schiller Institute and Lyndon LaRouche over here in Denmark, and these are the things that we're fighting for. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, go back to 1966. I met Lyndon LaRouche for the first time there in New York City. And that was shortly after the Kennedy assassination. And we had he was teaching a class in economics in a little makeshift arrangement. And some of us got together and he said that there's going to be a crisis based on the change in the philosophy of the USA that's being guided by these bankers, it's not just bankers, it's strategists in Wall Street and London. And the change is a very deep change away from a productive society. And it's really insane because it can't work out in the long run. It would lead to fascism. It would lead to a real breakdown in civilization. So, and these are brutal people, and the brutalization of the country was pretty obvious at that time. So, you know, I worked with that movement, and we created that movement back then. And so, yeah, that's he had the foresight to see that was happening at that time. That was the basis of that movement coming together.
Tony, here's a comment in the chat from Clark Matthews, and this might be a good note to sum things up on. Clark says, just a meeting note. Thank you for starting and using the email list. That is how I found my way here, and I'm glad I did.
Oh, yeah.
What do you need to finish volume 2?
Well, I did put out a GoFundMe appeal, which raised some money. I'm probably going to need more of that for editorial and other help, research help, and so forth. You can look at that if you want to. I'm going to need people, especially the kind of people that are participating here, to think about what might have piqued your interest historically, what topic or what part of this whole story might pique your interest, and get into it with me, help me, do some research, do your own work. You definitely have to do your own work along the lines of this history of progress. But I would certainly be happy to have collaborators. You can reach me at my, my email through this, and we can set up private communications. But I'd like to get research help. Some of you have already asked for that. And think of this, I'm not going to be around forever. Think of this as an ongoing project that goes into the future when you are going strong, and your children or other people's children. And this is the future of mankind. This to me, this project is the future of mankind, because it's a recapturing the identity, the best identity of human beings. If you think of it that way, join me in doing this work, and tell people about this. I'd like to get sales of the book, but it's got to be known what the problem is, and how I'm looking at solving it through this question of the identity of America, which challenges the whole way people think about politics and current public identities. So help me in that sense in developing the means, including the research means, to fulfill this. I do have very limited time each day. And I don't have the funds to do things, but the time is the most important thing. So any help that I get is crucial. So
Luke Trudell
Tony.
says, great Zoom event. When is the next one?
Good question. I actually had more slides prepared, but then I said, okay, that's much too much. And I was going off towards, FDR and Kennedy. There's a lot even in between. So there will be another one. I can't say when. But, I first have to do some more writing and get things going. I've got this part up to Edison is pretty deeply studied. And the whole thing, this whole project, all the way up through Kennedy and starting with Franklin, is the result of 40 years of work. The Industrial Revolution started by my going to England. That is my work on the Industrial. It was in 1988, and I started working on this before I did the treason book. There are other, many other people that are doing this kind of thing. Nancy Spanis has a wonderful book about Hamilton, very successful book. Bob Wesser is a deep researcher, deep historian, and we've got a lot of people here who are brainiacs here, so that can really contribute to the world. So anyway, I'm just talking about history. That's obviously only one part of what we need in the world. But
Tony,
yeah,
oh,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Interrupt you. This is no, I was going to ask you, in your mind, what are the three key things that America should do to recuperate that identity? What are the three, if you have to do a list with the three main dimensions or pillars to fix it, what would you say? That's it.
Well, I would, my overall idea, I think, could be summed up with four things. And that's the four freedoms of Franklin Roosevelt. Could you find that, Mark, could you find that slide with the four freedoms?
Sure, I'll get on it.
Oops. There it is. Okay. So in 1940, before the US officially got in the war, Franklin Roosevelt put forward the idea of the four freedoms. And you see them down here at the bottom. Freedom of religion. Everybody in the world should have freedom of religion. Now that's, if you go deeper into that, it starts with respect for religion itself. Our own religion, which many of us have lost, and other people's religion. Freedom of speech. Well, we have a guy like Assange who's on trial for telling the truth as a journalist and as a leaker of secrets which were war crimes. That's not freedom of speech. Freedom, and we censor ourselves too, right? Freedom from want. This, I guess, would be the principal controversial thing, really more controversial than the rest of it. Because, and it was controversial when Franklin Roosevelt said it, as it has been throughout our history, because the enemy, the Southern slave owners and the radical free trade advocates don't agree with this. But it is a right of human beings, ever since civilization began, to have a decent, to be treated decently. And that starts with having a decent living standard. And governments and international cooperation has to be geared around bringing about a high standard of living. That's human rights. There is no human rights without that. And then the last one is freedom from fear, which principally, look at the Norman Rockwell drawings of those four freedoms. And he shows a family worried that their children might have to suffer in a war, tucking in the children. But we don't believe in these things right now. This is who we are as a nation. Clearly, we are those four freedoms, but that includes wanting these things for the rest of mankind. That's part of who we are as well. As I show in both of these books, universal progress and universal rights. Actually, these four freedoms were the basis for the United Nations Charter, which is no longer, people don't pay any attention to that now. The world has agreed to them. These things are really international law, if you get down to it. So Carlos, the answer to your question, how do we get back to this? We have to see what the basis of our philosophy and our nation is. if you, for example, on religion, what do we mean by our religions? What good is a religion? Well, the Christian religion, the Muslim religion, the Jewish religion, the Confucian philosophy, the Hindu faith, many others have a deep connection to the divine identity of human beings, that human beings must be treated as the highest thing in the universe, and that human reason and human love are the first consideration for a society. That's not the case now. We got throwaways in Syria. We don't care if they die, as long as we can overthrow Assad. Crazy. It's not who we are. So, Carlos, to get back to this, you have to get people acquainted with who we actually are. This is the Freedom from Fear, Norman Rockwell's painting of FDR's, the fourth of FDR's, look, see that? It's the horrors of war at the time. Okay.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Also, if you're from Spain, Carlos, maybe we should give Gibraltar back to Spain. What do you think? Then we can, just kidding. That's
I think
might
that
be a
would
good idea, but I would say that I take the side of Spain in the 19th century attacks against Spain, right? And Spain was on our side in the revolution. So
yeah,
that's some history for people to consider, right? Anyway,
yeah, we should
wonderful
get
having
Gibraltar
you here.
back, sure.
What do you think, Mark? Are there other really pressing things in the chat?
Well, you always want to leave them wanting more, Tony.
Yeah, okay, good advice. Okay, well, why don't we?
Tony, I have a question. I have a hand up. I don't know if it can be seen.
Who's this?
Chris Schmidt.
Oh, Chris, go ahead.
Okay. Number one, I want to, I guess, compliment you on your approach in the Who We Are book, or the first volume, which encompassed, I think, some deliberation or understanding on your part that you have to, in a certain way, keep it simple. I mean, I was impressed because I read it fairly quickly, whereas normally a book that thick, that many pages, I wouldn't go through that quickly. But I found that the ideas were very accessible and the proofs were like incontrovertible. It didn't leave you, well, 40% one way, 60% the other way. You made a convincing argument. And I like the way at the end of each chapter, you had a series of graphics and pictures, which kind of, summarized the whole chapter. So I don't know if you plan to maintain that format in the second volume, but I thought it was definitely useful, and kind of different than most other history books that I've generally read. That's one thing. I have some other questions too. I don't know if you want to take that what I just said.
No, I'll continue that format, I think. Go ahead.
Well, I got to start my video here. Hold on.
Oh,
it started. Okay.
I see you. Go ahead.
Okay, fine.
Make it quick though, because we gotta go on to the other thing.
Okay, sure. I recently came across reading named by physicist, electrical engineer by the name of Carl Herring. He's apparently originally from Philadelphia, and in his work, he was one of the a board member, a director, I think at one point, of the National Organization of Electrical Engineers. But he took to task the practices in his own association of promoting people who didn't really have good credentials as scientists or engineers. So we just don't promote somebody because, they're advertising a product or something, right? They've got to actually be able to contribute to the field. And he also criticized a lot of the popular conventions and mathematics of physicists and scientists. He said, you can't reduce all this to numbers. These are physical principles. And he had a pretty good way, pedagogy, I think, of sticking to the idea of like the understanding of the physics as a process, if you will. And that there's no end to the degree of comprehension you can make of any important physical process. So I just want to know if in the second volume, if you thought you'd be getting into any of these issues of, say, the idea of science as making development accessible versus the idea of just, mathematics per se being adequate as an approach to science.
I was not really able to deal with that in the first volume. And I did get into a little sketch of just a real summary of the history of electrical development in that first.
I know you
volume.
talked about Bates in the first volume.
Yeah, but I did not get into the philosophy of Leibniz or these issues, which are profoundly important. We dealt with that, very, very repeatedly and successfully in the Fusion Energy Foundation. But there are many scientists going back to not just to Leibniz, but particularly in the 19th century. Some of them are in England, contrary to the British Empire. And there are many of them in America and in other countries, obviously continental science, and in other countries as well. Russians and people in Asia and people in other parts of the world who are not Newtonians. Phil Valenti wrote a wonderful book about the non-Newtonian, anti-Newtonian roots of the American Revolution. And what you bring, I'd like you, if you would.
He talked about Pepin, I believe.
Yeah, he did.
And
He
the steam
did.
engine.
But he's getting into the attack from Franklin and others on the Newtonian orthodoxy. But I would like you, if you would, to send me a message, make it as detailed as you want, about the guy you're talking about. And maybe you and I could cook up some more work along those lines. How did that sound?
That sounds fine.
Okay, it's very important.
I'll try to do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. I do have to apologize now, guys. I have to do some other things. So thank you all so much. God, wonderful to see many of you. I didn't get to see the faces, but I see some of them.
Bye, Tony. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.